Hi there. My name is Vivian Silverman, and I'm a neighbor of yours in VillageWalk. I'm also an active member of our environmental committee, which has been asked by our board of directors to help all of our residents better understand our stormwater ponds, why they're here, and how they need to be properly maintained. If you're like me, when I arrived in Sarasota from Northern Virginia in 2015, I was delighted to be able to purchase a beautiful home with a view from my backyard into a lovely body of water. I assumed that the water body behind my house was a similar type of lake to the ones I used to enjoy up north for hiking, boating, and swimming. As the weeks passed in my new home, I found so much pleasure from looking at the many colorful tropical birds who came to fish and even nest so close to my lanai. My view was beautiful and peaceful, and a great introduction to my new life in semi-tropical Florida. Well, after learning a lot more about Florida life over the past years, I now realize that I was totally wrong about these beautiful ponds in our backyards. They're not lakes at all. Please join me as I explain what I mean by that. In order to understand why our community has stormwater ponds, we first need to know a little about the history of our area. Beginning in the 1920s, Sarasota's nice winter weather and its beautiful bay, with its abundance of marine life, attracted many people here from the north to build winter homes. With the new prosperity after World War II, increased demand encouraged large-scale development of planned communities. What had previously been large open citrus orchards and cattle ranches were now being paved over by developers. The pine flats were cut down, and the low-lying wetlands were seen as being in the way of progress, so they were drained and dredged to accommodate urban development. The coastal marshes that were anchored by their mangrove trees, shown in the aerial photo on the left, were dredged to make deeper harbors for bigger boats. More and more of the former marshes and wetlands were now looking like the photo on the right. These changes to the natural landscape would soon create big problems for Sarasota. Because much of the open ground was now covered over with asphalt, and the wide expanses of interconnected wetland ponds were gone, the land could no longer absorb enough of the Florida summer's heavy storm rainfall. When the storm drains and sewers were overwhelmed and then backed up, there was serious flooding of the new urban areas, with alarming damage and high cost to everyone. Sarasota County decided to do something about this. In the 1980s, Sarasota County hired a local erosion engineering firm to design a new residential stormwater pond system. A simplified diagram of this design is shown on this slide. This man-made wetland system of retention ponds, surrounded with grasses and plants, and connected by pipes and gravity to streams and low-lying wetland preserves, would have the same advantages as the earlier natural wetlands that it was replacing. This new stormwater pond system needed to accomplish these three main objectives. 1. To control flooding nearby and downstream. Like a giant sponge, the system safely retains rapidly rising stormwater and holds it until that water can slowly percolate into the ground or continue to flow downstream. 2. To filter out the contaminants that stormwater picks up as it flows into the pond. Just like in natural wetlands, the new ponds need grasses and native plants along their shorelines and in the water to filter out the incoming pollutants, thus keeping their water clean before it flows downstream into our bays and our coastal waters. 3. To keep the soft sandy soil that makes up the new pond banks from being washed downstream. The deep root systems of the shoreline and aquatic grass and plants hold on strongly to the soil around them, and so they stop bank erosion and shallow shelf erosion from happening. This new stormwater pond system turned out to work very well, so the county mandated that all home builders had to include this new system into every new development, including VillageWalk and all of Palmer Ranch. Each community's stormwater pond permit makes it the HOA's responsibility to maintain their pond system with the proper plantings so that it can continue to protect their area and the areas downstream from them. To make sure that the HOA is doing its job, the county agency SwiftMud which is the Southwest Florida Water Management District, reminds each community to have its stormwater pond system inspected by a professional pond engineer every 5 years. Ponds that fail this inspection have to be repaired, sometimes with dredging and artificial banks at a very high community expense, which can easily run up into the millions of dollars. One of the biggest problems with maintaining the ponds correctly comes about because many people coming from up north confuse the stormwater ponds in Florida with the recreational lakes they've been familiar with, especially if those ponds have no perimeter plantings. Many people down here will call ponds lakes, which only increases the confusion. If you look at the two photos in front of you and compare the two lists of their main features, you'll see how very different stormwater ponds and recreational lakes actually are, both in their structure and in how each should look to stay healthy. Their main differences are: 1. Ponds are shallow, man-made, and dug out of soft soil. Lakes are deep, naturally formed, and have rocky bottoms and sides. 2. Because sunlight easily reaches most of the pond's bottom sediment and the water stays warm, this promotes the constant growth of aquatic plants, phytoplankton, and beneficial algae. For this reason, stormwater ponds will always look murky. They will never look the same as the pristine fishing or swimming lakes, which are deep with cold, clear water, so plants or algae can't grow from the bottom. 3. Ponds need their native grasses, plants, and algae to hold on to the soft bank and basin soil, to create oxygen, and to provide habitat for the pond's entire ecosystem. Lakes have rocky sides to prevent bank erosion, and they support their ecosystem with oxygen created by water turbulence and from phytoplankton, insects, and larvae that feed the small fish. 4. Ponds were never meant for human recreation, especially in Florida, where they're a natural habitat for alligators. Lakes are often used for recreational activities such as fishing, boating, and swimming. Unfortunately, many communities have ponds that have been without their plant buffers since they were first opened. Builders often won't install plants in and around ponds, even though they should, because they know they'll get more money for units with clear water views. All the homeowner knows is that they've paid a premium price for their unit because of its water view. They'll see any later attempt to add plantings as adding, quote, weeds to their lake, unquote. HOA and boards can also be very ignorant about how to maintain their stormwater system. Unless they've carefully read and followed their stormwater permits, this community ignorance continues for years and years. Meanwhile, ponds continue to be mismanaged with no plantings around them and with the turf grass mown down to the water's edge. Unfortunately, this is the worst thing you can do to a stormwater pond, and it will make it very unhealthy. On this slide, you'll see a visual comparison between a healthy stormwater pond on the left and an unhealthy stormwater pond on the right. The photo on the left, taken in nearby Mira-Lago, shows how a healthy stormwater pond is supposed to look. Notice that it has two plant biofilters. The first biofilter is the 3-foot wide grass shoreline buffer that is kept trimmed to stay around 11 inches tall. This is often called a no-mow zone, or NMZ. The taller grass within it has deep, strong roots that hold onto the bank soil around them and that prevent the banks from eroding. That is illustrated in the diagram below. Its taller height also helps to safely trap leaves and trash from being washed into the ponds. As plants need nitrogen to grow, the grass absorbs this excess nutrient from the incoming irrigation water, which in Sarasota is nitrogen-rich, recycled gray water from sewage treatment plants. Grass processes the excess nitrogen and then releases it into the air. Too much excess nitrogen in the water is responsible for feeding harmful, large algae blooms that rob the pond water of oxygen and kill the fish. The second biofilter you see is made up of the aquatic plants inside the pond water. They are connected by long stalks to their own deep roots, which hold fast onto the sediment at the bottom of the pond. They are keeping the shallow littoral shelves from washing away, and the floating pads and rushes that you see in this pond are also absorbing excess nutrients and other contaminants from the water and naturally processing them back into the air. The aquatic plants that have been chosen for our ponds include pickerel weed, duck potato, and spike rush. These plants will fill in sideways but won't get very tall. Plus, they're depth dependent, which means that they can't grow in more than 2 to 3 feet of water. That ensures that they will stay along the edges of the pond and not fill in its center area, where the water is too deep for them. This should ensure a nice pond view, balanced with both low plantings and open water. In contrast, the photo on the right shows a very unhealthy stormwater pond. As shown in the lower diagram, the shallow, weak root system of constantly mowed, short turf grass cannot hold on to the surrounding soil, so these unprotected banks will continue to erode away. The lush, green pond banks that you saw in the left photo have now become brown, barren, and exposed. Meanwhile, all of that eroded sediment is filling up the pond basin, which will take away the pond's ability to hold enough stormwater and to prevent flooding. At the same time, with no plant biofilters in place, the water is becoming increasingly contaminated with excess nutrients and other pollutants, and the pond's ecosystem is rapidly degrading. The damage happening under the water's surface does not become obvious to residents until large, ugly algae blooms appear, and it's also apparent that the birds and wildlife have left for healthier areas. Do you ever wonder what causes bank erosion? One of the answers to that question is that pond banks are very fragile because they were dredged out of soft soil and not gouged out of rocks. From the day they're filled with water, natural forces begin to eat away at the banks. The main forces are listed on this slide in front of you. Some are very small but constant, like the little wind-driven waves you barely notice on the water's surface. And some are massive, like the downpours during heavy summer storms and hurricanes. Another cause comes from the automatic irrigation sprinklers and drip hoses, which create constant water runoff that carries sediment along with it. Yet another important source of bank erosion comes from allowing heavy riding mowers to mow grass right down to the water's edge. The diagram on the right shows you how they cause the damage. Their weight compresses the soft soil, and their vibrations shake the fragile bank until portions of it crumble into the pond. A riding mower like this should never be allowed to drive closer than 3 feet to any pond bank. There is one more interesting phenomenon for you to see on this slide, shown in the diagram to the left, and that is how the deep root systems of tall grass encourage the natural capillary action of pond water to move up into the bank soil, and then those roots hold on to the moist soil around themselves. This moist soil will make the healthy bank feel mushy if you step on it. Know that this is a sign of a healthy living bank that is resistant to erosion. But if those tall grasses are cut down, the roots become weak, and the bank soil dries out, becoming compacted and hard, and that is when the bank becomes most susceptible to erosion. Now it's time to take a new voyage of discovery by looking beneath the surface of the water and learning about the many plants and animals that depend on a pond staying healthy. A pond's ecosystem is most simply explained using the 3 main levels of its food chain: the producers, the consumers, and the decomposers. On the first level are the producers, all of the green plants around and inside the pond. They use photosynthesis to produce the food and the oxygen that support the rest of the pond life. They do this by transforming the sun's energy, water, and carbon dioxide into sugar molecules that will serve as food for other organisms. They also expel oxygen as a byproduct, which is dissolved into the water, allowing all of the pond animals to breathe. Different types of pond plants offer some overlapping and also some different benefits. Shoreline grass and plants, also known as a no-mow zone, stabilize the soft banks from eroding, clean the incoming water, and provide food, shelter, and a safe habitat for many of the insects and animals that depend on the pond to live. Aquatic plants are separated into three main types, depending on which area of the pond they live in. The entire pond ecosystem depends on the plants. Besides providing food for herbivores and creating dissolved oxygen to support all the pond creatures, they also process carbon dioxide from the water out into the air and process out fish waste from the water. They provide a safe habitat for the smaller creatures and fish that need to hide from the larger pond fish and other predators. The first type of aquatic plant are the emergent plants. These show most of their stems, leaves, flowers, and fruits above the water's surface. They're rooted deep into the underwater soil, preventing its erosion from the shallow, littoral pond shelves. The second type are submerged plants. These are also rooted deeply into the pond soil, but with the rest of the plant living underwater. They're the most efficient plants at producing oxygen and at filtering the water, as well as providing fish and other pond creatures safe places to hide. The third type of aquatic plant are floating plants. They don't grow with their roots in the soil like the others. Their roots hang down into the water, and the rest of the plant floats freely on top of the water, like a flat green raft. They absorb nutrients through their leaves, create oxygen, give a place for fish to hide, provide shade to cool the water, and they reduce the sunlight that helps to feed algae blooms. Another type of aquatic plant that's very important are phytoplankton. They're a special class of tiny aquatic free-floating plants that includes algae. Either they lack roots or they use holdfasts to cling onto rocks or soil. Algae is very efficient at producing oxygen and provides an important food source for the numerous tiny pond animals. It's important for you to know that a reasonable amount of algae in a Florida pond is normal and quite beneficial, as it provides food, creates oxygen, and processes fish and plant waste into nitrates that other plants use for food. We'll talk more in depth about the difference between beneficial algae and harmful algae when we see the following slide. On the second level of the ecosystem are the consumers, organisms and animals that don't produce their own food, but instead feed on either plants or other animals. The smallest ones are called zooplankton. They're the microscopic floating or weakly swimming invertebrate animals that drift with water currents. They feed on the even more tiny phytoplankton plants. Zooplankton, in their turn, become food for the next larger size of consumers, the pond insects, small fish, and salamanders. The larger consumers, such as large fish, turtles, and alligators, will eat those that are smaller than themselves. One step removed are the other large consumers, the fishing birds, such as herons, cranes, pelicans, ospreys, etc., who don't live under the water, but who depend on catching pond fish and other creatures to sustain themselves and their young. On the third level of the ecosystem are found the decomposers. These are bacteria and fungi who live on the bottom of a pond and who help to process dead organic matter, which comes both from plants and animals, into gases and chemical nutrients that are then released back into the soil, the water, and the air. This makes the nutrients nitrogen and phosphorus available once more to be absorbed by plants, so that they will be recycled back by the plants into food and oxygen. And so the wonderful cycle of life in a healthy pond ecosystem begins again. I'd like to talk to you now about algae in stormwater ponds, because this is a plant that's widely misunderstood. Algae is a simple non-flowering plant from a large group that includes many single-celled forms and different kinds of seaweed. It contains chlorophyll, but it lacks true stems, roots, leaves, and vascular tissue. A small amount of algae is normal and beneficial in almost all ponds in the world, and it's an important source of nutrition and oxygen for the pond animals. If you look at photo number 1 to the left, The floating brown-colored algae clustered around the emergent aquatic plants is perfectly normal, and it's a beneficial part of this pond's ecosystem. There are two types of common algae, suspended algae and string algae. You can see the difference if you place some pond water in a clear glass. If the water itself is colored green, you have suspended algae. If the water is clear, you may have string algae. This typically grows on rocks around the perimeter of the pond, producing long strings that in turn intertwine and form mats that float just under the water's surface. You can see what string algae looks like in photo number 2 to the right. It's also a beneficial algae. If you see a small amount of either floating algae or string algae in a pond, the best thing to do is leave it alone. Know that it's beneficial for the pond system. And if you find that it's ugly and want it out, then hand harvest it yourself. Remove it with a net, and do not ask for an aquatics company to come and spray harsh herbicides into the pond in order to get rid of it. That sets you up for bigger and bigger algae blooms. So I will explain why that is. If your pond ecosystem becomes out of balance, for instance, if it doesn't have enough aquatic plants to absorb the excess nutrients in the water, or it's missing a buffer zone to absorb the incoming nutrients from the irrigation water and other things, the excess nutrients and the sunlight will combine to feed large and potentially harmful algae blooms. An algae bloom is a rapid reproduction and spreading of algae, which typically occurs during the hot, sunny, calm part of the summer. A bloom can cover your pond with algae in a very short period of time. If it's particularly bad, you may hear it described as carpet algae, as it looks like it's taking over or carpeting your pond. An algae bloom or carpet is shown in photo number 3 on the upper right. If you take a look at this pond, you will notice that it doesn't have any biofilters. It has no zone to absorb the excess nutrients coming in from irrigation water and rainwater, and it has no aquatic plants to absorb nutrients in the water and provide shade. And so this pond, unfortunately, without its biofilters, is set up for very bad and harmful algae blooms like this one. The major problems with an algae bloom go far beyond its being unsightly. This overgrowth of algae consumes a lot of oxygen when deprived of sunlight at night and on cloudy days. And the thick algae carpet blocks sunlight from the other underwater plants, which will then begin to die. Each individual algal organism is short-lived. When they sink down to the bottom, they form a thick layer of muck or decaying organic matter. The bacteria in the bottom of the pond that break down this increased muck will also multiply fast, and then they consume too much of the remaining dissolved oxygen in the water. The resulting lack of oxygen will cause your fish and other aquatic life to die off in large numbers, starting with the largest fish who need the most oxygen. The second problem with the large amount of algae dying off is a release of a lot of the nutrients back into the pond. When the algae are decomposed by microorganisms, nutrients like nitrogen and phosphorus are released back into the water. They're now available to feed the next generation of algae blooms. This begins a vicious cycle of larger and larger algae blooms that will keep increasing their harmful effects on the pond life. Photo number 4 shows what is called blue-green algae. It may look like algae, but it's actually made up of millions of a green-colored bacteria called cyanobacteria. It's often described as looking like a slick, oily, green paint spill, and it gives off an unpleasant smell like rotten eggs. It appears in badly compromised ponds filled with too many nutrients, and it's very dangerous. It gives off neurotoxins that often result in fish kills and health damage to people who either touch the bloom or breathe it in. If you ever see a patch of cyanobacteria that looks like this, report it immediately to our town manager and don't attempt to get near it. Just like the old adage, a stitch in time saves 9, it's easier and cheaper to prevent excessive algae than it is to treat it. The first and best way to prevent algae blooms is to maintain shoreline plant buffers or a no-mow zone to filter out incoming nutrients. and to maintain enough aquatic plants in the water to filter out even more nutrients. At least 60% of your pond's shallow littoral shelves should be covered with a variety of native filtering plants. The more aquatic plants you have, the more they'll compete with algae for the same nutrients. And at a certain tipping point, you'll notice a drastic reduction in your algae population. Another good way to prevent harmful large algae blooms is to work with an environmentally responsible aquatics company, like the highly acclaimed local company Beautiful Ponds. Instead of using harmful and toxic copper-based herbicide sprays, including chelated copper, which do incredible harm to your entire ecosystem of the pond, they will use beneficial bacteria, milder peroxide-based herbicides, and they also use hand harvesting whenever possible. As a matter of fact, having your community work with environmentally responsible landscapers and aquatics companies is the best way to ensure that your pond system will stay healthy for generations to come, and that it will continue to thrive with lots of wildlife, and your homes will retain their strong property values. Like all 20-year-old Florida pond systems, ours in VillageWalk is now at a dangerous tipping point. This is especially true when ponds like ours have been mismanaged for years by mowing turf grass right down to the water's edge, and by neglecting to maintain shoreline and aquatic plant buffers. In VillageWalk, our ponds have been poorly managed like this for most of our 20-year history. Usually the first thing that residents notice after about 20 years is that their pond bank erosion has become more obvious, along with the loss of a lot of land next to the ponds. Some homeowners on Valente have reported that they have lost at least 5 feet of land behind their homes to bank erosion, and others on Tristino have engineering proof of having lost over 9 feet of land between their homes and their ponds. These are all signs that our community must act immediately to stop any further erosion, or it may end up being too late to save our banks and our ponds without spending huge amounts of money. Maintaining your ponds naturally with plant buffers is very inexpensive. Growing a grass no-mow zone is free, trimming it costs next to nothing, and aquatic plantings only cost between $1 and $2 per linear foot installed. But after too much bank soil is eroded and filled up the pond basins, our ponds will fail their inspection, and we will need to have them dredged out. We may also have to pay to have lost banks rebuilt with artificial ones. Unlike natural plantings, dredging and artificial banks are very expensive. Dredging costs over $300 per hour, and erosion companies charge between $100 and $200 per linear foot of shoreline that they rebuild. Which price would you rather pay to maintain each linear foot of pond bank behind your home? $2 or $200? Keep this in mind as you view the following slides. In order to know more about the current state of our 20-year-old banks, VillageWalk commissioned 2 bank erosion studies from Solitude, our aquatics company. Although they were only done 6 months apart, their conclusions were strikingly different. The first study, done in October 2020, said that they didn't see much evidence of bank erosion at all, and that only one stretch of shoreline along Tristino Lane was so badly eroded that it needed to be rebuilt with a geosock. This is a type of artificial bank made of strong cloth filled with pond sediment, then covered with turf grass. This first bank remediation was not cheap. It cost all of us about $100 per linear foot, coming to a total of $13,300. The second erosion study from May of 2021 stated that now Solitude found that there were many other pond bank areas suffering from serious erosion problems. They designated 13 such areas involving a total of 8,570 linear feet that they said should be rebuilt with artificial banks. The red lines shown on the map in front of you show where those 13 areas are located. Their closest street addresses are listed on the right side of the slide. That bank remediation total would come out to many hundreds of thousands of dollars for all of us to pay in either special assessments or a rise in our HOA fees. Justifiably concerned, our board wanted to see for themselves if the bank erosion in these 13 areas was actually as bad as the study indicated. So they asked a small group from the Environmental Committee to go out and take photos of the condition of those banks. These photos are displayed on this and the following 4 slides. The 2 diagrams on the left will help you better understand what happens to banks when they erode. The top one shows what our original pond bank slope would have looked like 20 years ago. A gentle angle of soil forming a straight line from the top of the land down into the pond water. Note that the grass here is shown to be uniformly short, which means that it is being mowed right down to the water's edge. The bottom diagram shows the same bank after it has been eroding for a while. You will notice that the straight line of soil has been undercut by the natural actions of wind and water. The sloped dotted line shows you where the pond bank soil used to be before it was washed away into the pond. Imagine this amount of erosion multiplied by VillageWalk's 44,195 linear feet of shoreline, and you may grasp just how big an amount of our soil has been eroding and is filling up our ponds. The photos on the right show us what is visibly left behind after banks have badly eroded. You see vertical soil drop-offs or benches. Sticking out of them are the exposed roots of the grass and the plants that have yet to be washed away and are still holding on to life. The flat, dry shelves below these benches are what's left of the badly eroded sediment. Here are some other after effects of bank erosion. The photo on the top left demonstrates a bank that has been severely undercut. The white stripe above the undercut clearly shows the layer of Florida soft sand, sandwiched between the dark loam soil above and the pebble-covered sediment below. Because Florida soil is generally loose and dry, it crumbles easily if it doesn't have any deep plant roots to hold it in place. To the right, you see some of the many large holes that are seen dotted across the exposed banks, which further add to their destabilization. The ruler shows that this particular hole is quite deep, around 5.5 inches. Here, the upper right photo clearly shows you the small wind-driven pond waves that are constantly eating away at every pond bank. The damage they do is slow but relentless. The other photos on this slide show what was very easy for everyone in VillageWalk to see during our dry springtime, that wide areas of eroded sediment have been exposed along all of our pond banks and have been washed away along the base of our bridges. This lack of protection from the elements will only speed up bank erosion. These areas need to be protected as soon as possible by adding the deep root systems of tall grass no-mow zones and of aquatic plants, in order to stop the rest of the sediment from being washed away. On this slide, you see other disturbing signs of erosion damage. On the upper left, a white PVC drainage pipe is badly exposed that once was covered with soil up to its tip. Below it, there is a lot of metal landscaping mesh that used to be covered with turf grass. In the middle are a group of large rocks that are being washed into the pond. And on the right, you see a very large piece of weathered concrete with cables sticking out of it. All of these are unsightly, and none of them was ever meant to be found like this, being washed down into our stormwater ponds. This last page of erosion photos shows one of many areas where the root systems of our cypress trees, normally protected under layers of soil and underwater, have now been badly exposed to the sun and wind. Disturbances like this to root systems can damage or even kill trees. The last photo at the bottom shows some deep water-filled holes. They're being investigated by our HOA in order to see if they might have been created by an armored catfish. This is a non-native invasive fish that digs long burrows along pond banks, making them likely to collapse if walked upon. Even though all of these photos show serious bank erosion, we are hoping that there is still time to save our banks and our ponds using natural and inexpensive plant buffers, rather than paying hundreds of thousands for dredging and artificial banks. We are encouraging our board members to invite the two Sarasota pond experts, Abby Tierna and Molly Holland, to examine our ponds as soon as possible, so we can get the benefit of their many years of experience advising other pond communities in our situation. This is a free service provided by the county and the University of Florida, and many communities like ours have benefited greatly from their counsel. The other recommendation voiced by concerned VillageWalk residents is for us to regrow our no-mow zones immediately around all of our ponds, to halt all current bank erosion while the summer rainy season progresses. That would allow all the time the board might need to conduct further studies with erosion engineering companies, while also protecting the banks from suffering a lot more bank erosion. Are you okay with our ponds continuing to decline like this? If we accept the status quo, allowing our landscapers to continue mowing our grass right down to the water's edge on either some or on all of our ponds, the bank and land erosion will only continue to get worse. Our pond basins will fill up with sediment and muck, the water quality will degrade even more, the fish will die, and the wildlife will leave. All of this will greatly lower our quality of life along with our property values. In the end, our pond system will fail its county inspection, and all of VillageWalk's homeowners will be paying millions of dollars out of pocket to have our pond system dredged out and rebuilt, along with having to install both natural plant buffers to protect the new artificial banks. This has already happened to neighboring communities that waited too long before growing their no-mow zones and planting enough aquatic plants. Chestnut Creek, Waterford, and the Isles are now paying erosion control companies between $1 and $3.5 million to replace their eroded banks with artificial ones, all of this through special assessments to their homeowners. Their grounds are all torn up and the property values have dropped, and VillageWalk will be joining them soon. Or would you rather be living with healthy ponds like this? This type of pond is by far the better choice for VillageWalk residents to make. This lush green pond from Stony Brook Golf and Country Club, with its plant biofilters, is not eroding, has clean water, and is thriving with birds and other wildlife. Healthy ponds like this have been proven to add at least 20% to the property values of their communities, as new home buyers see their beauty and their abundance of wildlife as very desirable. VillageWalk needs to maintain its ponds like this, so that we can join the other successful pond communities in Palmer Ranch, like Stony Brook, Mira-Lago, and Rivendell. This is the only way to ensure that our pond systems will continue to add to our quality of life for many, many years to come. Along the way to accomplishing these beneficial changes, you will run into other residents who don't want any changes made to the ponds and who will come up with strong objections. This resident pushback happens in every community that starts to change the look of their ponds. These people are used to seeing our ponds without perimeter plantings, and they don't understand why stormwater ponds need to look different than recreational lakes. They'll complain that the new grass and aquatic plant buffers look like, quote, messy weeds, unquote, and they may even broadcast that the taller grass is harboring dangerous animals like rats and snakes. They may say that they just don't like how the plantings look and that they prefer their ponds to look pristine, in other words, with no plants at all. Here are some things that we in VillageWalk can say and do that have helped with resident pushback in other communities. 1. We need to explain through community education that these ponds are actually artificial wetlands, not lakes, and that Sarasota County mandates through our stormwater permit that VillageWalk has to maintain them to look and function like natural wetlands with natural plant buffers. That's not a choice for us to make. We have to abide by our county permit. If we don't maintain our ponds correctly, then we will all face having to pay millions of dollars in special assessments to rebuild our ponds. 2. We can also reassure our neighbors that the new grass buffers will be kept trimmed low and looking manicured, especially along the shorelines right behind everyone's homes. It won't be permitted to get tall and wild looking. nor will it block their view of the pond wildlife. Only the shorter aquatic plants will go there as well for the same reasons. This landscape style of no-mow zone, as shown in this photo, is the one that finds the widest acceptance among homeowners. It combines attractive aesthetics with ease of maintenance. Its width is only 3 feet wide, which makes it easier for one person to trim it, and the grass height is kept regularly topped off to stay 11 inches or less. With these size dimensions, a no-mow zone is still very effective at stopping bank erosion and in filtering out contaminants, while not blocking homeowners' views of the pond wildlife, which is always a big concern. Besides the landscape style of no-mow zone shown on the previous slide, there are 2 other main styles of pond landscaping used in HOA communities. These styles allow their grass buffer to grow taller and look more natural, and their aquatic plants are chosen from taller and fuller varieties. These styles are usually reserved for shorelines that are not directly behind homes, as seen in these 2 photos. The natural style on the left is often used along common areas and walking paths, and the wild preserve style on the right is most often seen next to forested areas and parkland. Using different styles of perimeter plant buffers is important in providing more visual interest in communities and also creates different kinds of wildlife habitat for a more balanced pond ecosystem. Another objection that you may hear from some residents is that no-mow zones cost too much to maintain. Nothing is farther from the truth. Neighboring communities like Mira-Lago and Stony Brook don't pay a penny over their normal landscaping contract price to have their no-mow zones trimmed 12 to 18 times per year. The Woodlands at Rivendell pay under $1 per linear foot annually for 19 trims. This low cost is only logical when you think about it. Under their landscaping contract, the company is caring for the same amount of land next to the ponds as they always were, but now, in maintaining a no-mow zone, they're using less staff and tending the area only half as often. Let me explain. To take care of the same 3-foot wide area before a no-mow zone is grown, they had to use 2 men, 1 man on a riding mower to mow the grass up to a foot away from the pond bank, and then a second man on foot, using a weed whacker to trim the last foot of grass right next to the water. But after growing a no-mow zone, now they only need to use 1 man, walking with a hedge trimmer held low on a pole attachment, as you can see in this photo, to make 1 pass and trim the top off a 3-foot ribbon of grass. Another thing that's important to understand is that when you are constantly mowing grass to keep it 4 inches tall, that stimulates it to keep growing very fast. But if you let it get taller, its growth rate slows down, and so it needs trimming less often. Once a grass no-mow zone has reached 11 inches tall, it only needs to be trimmed half as often as before, once every 2 weeks in the wet summer season and once a month or less in the dry winter season. So this same 3-foot wide area along bank shorelines now only needs trimming 18 times per year, rather than the 36 times it used to need. For all of the above reasons, it is the honest thing to do for a landscaper to charge little or nothing to trim a community's grass no-mow zones. Our environmental committee has already offered to provide our HOA with the names and contact information for highly recommended local landscaping and aquatics companies who have been doing an excellent job for many years maintaining healthy ponds for other Palmer Ranch communities at fair prices. I hope that you've enjoyed learning more about what our stormwater pond system is all about and why it needs both no-mow zones and aquatic plants, along with environmentally responsible pond maintenance, to stay healthy and to do its job protecting all of us. And now our ponds need your help to do a few things. The first is to share what you've learned here with your VillageWalk neighbors and to please encourage them to view this video, which can be easily accessed using a hyperlink found both on a flyer in our HOA office and on our VillageWalk website under the document folder called Landscaping and Lakes or Ponds. The second is to please send a short email to our board to encourage them to do what is best to maintain our ponds in a healthy and affordable way, that is, with maintaining both natural plant buffers. The third is to become part of our Healthy Pond Stewardship Program by becoming a volunteer for our Environmental Committee. To find out more about this, please send an email to Aileen Forst at the email address found on the slide in yellow, which is aforst9@comcast.net. We've come to the end of our program. We thank you very much for caring for our ponds and what they add to the quality of life in VillageWalk, and we wish you a wonderful day. Goodbye.